Hey everyone, so welcome to today's lecture in Intro to Political Science. So today we're going to be looking at voting and elections as our topic. So the reading for today from the textbook, chapter 7. So let's get started. When we're talking about elections, we're going to talk a lot about meaningful elections. There's been a debate often that you'd find when we're trying to categorize countries based on their type of government between, say, a democracy and a non-democracy. And when we're talking about what makes a democracy, is having a vote sufficient, is having elections sufficient to have a democracy, or do you need something more? And there's all kinds of different answers, but typically one of the main criteria that you'll see that most people can agree on is that elections in and of themselves aren't enough. They have to be what we could refer to as meaningful elections. And they're only meaningful if those elected have real power and the following conditions exist, right? So if you're voting for people and they have no real power, then yes, there's been elections, but we couldn't really refer to that as, say, necessarily democracy. But also to define meaningful elections, they have to have some of these following characteristics. So first, voters can choose freely among candidates and parties, right? So there's got to be candidates that are available, often organized by political parties, and voters are free to make whichever choice they want. So they're not forced or intimidated into choosing members of a particular party or choosing particular candidates. They're free to be able to do so, to make their own choices based on whatever values or whatever calculations they want to make in deciding on who the preferred candidate is for them. One of the ways that this is typically ensured that people are free to make the decisions that they want is the use of a secret ballot to protect against intimidation or bribery. So that if we don't know who you voted for, then it's difficult to be able to intimidate you for your vote. If all votes were recorded who made whichever particular vote, then it would be possible for someone to threaten, say, if we find your name on this list as having voted for this particular candidate, then we're going to, come and see you at your home and react violently, attack you. Similarly, if we see your name on this list, on the other side, we will reward you financially, we'll reward your family, we'll give you this particular good. So respond through bribery. The ways that you could avoid kind of these different problems is to have it where nobody knows which ballot you cast. It may be known that you cast a ballot, but not who you voted for. Meaningful competition. So all citizens have the right to run an election. If not everybody has the right to run an election, then not everybody has the same chance to have their views represented. So it really has to be openness to full competition that anyone can be able to participate. This is one of the areas that took longer in many democracies to be able to establish over time. So there used to be many different considerations that went into place, whether it was related to gender, race, owning land or property, that qualified you for being able to run for office. There still are some qualifications. For example, many different offices have particular age requirements. So at minimum must be an adult. For example, in the States, for running for president, there is a minimum age requirement. I believe it's 35 to be able to run for president. So that does remove some people from being able to run, but eventually they would be able to. So it's a matter of time as opposed to a complete exclusion, where if it was based on gender or race, that would be a complete exclusion. Universal suffrage. So other than being able to have anyone run, this would be having everyone be able to vote. So universal suffrage means that all adults in a society are able to vote. Now, there is some debate that is ongoing within democracies as to what that age of majority should be. Should be 18? That's the dividing line for being able to vote. Should it be higher? Some might even go as high as 25. It's up to 25 where cognitive development is kind of the brain finishes developing or completes its development. Up until 25, the brain is still largely developing. So some would make an argument that it should be raised. Some would make an argument it should be lower, say to something like 16. If you're able to drive, you should, be able to vote. In some countries, you're able to register or enlist in the military at 17 or an age like that. If you're able to fight for your country, should you be able to vote? So there are debates about whether the voting age should be raised or lowered, but generally speaking, we want, at least based wherever that line may be, we want everybody above that line, above that age line, to be able to vote. Information. So we want everyone to be able to be informed in making their decision. So that could involve things like limits on campaign spending. So you couldn't just have a wealthy candidate spending so much and flooding the market with so much information about them that it drowns out other candidates. And so people are just so much better informed about that particular candidate, which would give them an advantage. It also includes things like media not being biased in its coverage, which in certain contexts may be becoming a greater and greater problem as you have fragmentation of the media and people following particular media outlets. They're not getting a balanced view from the media. So this could be an emerging problem that we see. Independent commission, so parties should be able to observe casting and counting of votes. So things like we should have drawing of electoral districts shouldn't be a political consideration, and we should have kind of like independent auditors who are counting the vote and ensuring that the vote counting is fair. And then regular vote. So you could have all of these characteristics, but if you only vote every 20 years, it's hard to really consider, yes, it's an election. I suppose on this, nominally it's a democracy, but really to have meaningful elections, it has to be happening fairly regularly. How often regular is open for debate. Many countries follow about a 4-year cycle. In some countries, it's fixed, like in the United States, there's a fixed date for the election every 4 years, so you know in advance when it will be. In other countries, it's not fixed, so it could be in many parliamentary systems where there could be confidence votes. It could happen earlier if the government loses confidence, but also many in parliamentary systems, many governments have the ability, the party, the majority position can call the election when they see fit. So it should be about around every 4 years, but say after 3.5 years, if they think they're in a particularly good situation, they may call a vote. Or at 4 years, if they're in a bad situation, maybe they'll wait to 4.5 years before they call it. I just want to return to universal suffrage because this is one of the areas where even the countries that we would refer to as democracies were slower at really meeting the standard of meaningful election that's representing everyone. So for example, in Canada, if we look at gender, so universal suffrage being the right of all adult citizens to vote regardless of gender, ethnicity, wealth, or education. So for example, in Canada, we see that women gained the right to vote at different times, and these would have all been after voting began in Canada, after Canada became a country. So Canada became a country in 1867, but women were first allowed to vote in 1916 in Manitoba, Saskatchewan, and Alberta. 1917, provisionally, as kind of part of wartime measures at federal elections, and also in British Columbia and Ontario. In 1918, permanent change for federal elections and changes in Nova Scotia. 1919 in New Brunswick, 1922 in PEI, 1925 in Newfoundland, although bear in mind Newfoundland wasn't a Canadian province at the time. And then as late as 1940 in Quebec, women gained the right to vote. And then you could also in different countries look at things like wealth. There were wealth measures for being able to vote at different times, so owning property. Certainly ethnicity, so there were racial minorities in many different countries only later gained the right to vote. So in many democracies, voting was a privilege afforded only to white voters initially, and then racial minorities or ethnic minorities gain the right to vote later on. So these are problems where when we talk about, was Canada democracy back in 1867? In many ways, you could say yes, but when we look at universal suffrage, we could certainly see limitations on Canada as a democracy, but before, well, in Quebec before 1940, in the federal system before 1918, there were, half the adult population was precluded from being able to vote just based on gender. So how do we carry out elections? What are the different electoral systems that we find that allow us to carry out elections? So not every country holds elections in the exact same way. So an electoral system is a system used to translate votes that people cast in the composition of the legislature and the selection of the government. So how are elections held, and how do those votes translate into representation in the government? So translate, for example, into seats in parliament. Different countries, even that have parliaments, use different methods for, based on the vote, translating those into the number of seats that different parties get in the parliament, in the legislature. So electoral systems differ to the extent to which the following criteria are served. So accurately represent the vote cast for each party, right? So ideally, we would want the number of seats that parties receive to somewhat accurately represent the number of votes they got. So if you get more votes, you get more seats. If you get less votes, you get less seats. Ideally, we'd want some form of accurate representation of how well the parties did in terms of the number of seats allocated. Provide a link between representatives and voters, right? So ideally, we want people to be able to have access to the government, not just through elections, but also through being able to speak to a member of the legislature, to be represented by a member of the legislature. So the more that people know who they're able to speak to, which representatives are representing them, the stronger the link is. Facilitate the accountability of government, so the ability to punish governments if they're not performing well, or reward them if they're performing well, and enable governments and representatives to claim that they have the support of the majority of voters, right? So if they could claim that they've got the support of the majority of voters, then that will often enhance the legitimacy of a government. So imagine in a democratic country, two majority governments, one's received 35% of the vote and one's received 55% of the vote. The one that's received 35% of the vote, yes, it may have received more than any other political party, but still only about 1/3, just over 1/3 of voters voted for them. So then if they're going and passing without compromise with other political parties, or passing an agenda, yes, they have the legal right to do so based on the electoral system, but there's an element, so it's legitimate in that sense, but there's some will critique it on the grounds of legitimacy, saying that you didn't get a full mandate from a majority of the population. If another political party, received 55% of the vote, well then yes, more than half the country had said that they want this party to be in power. So from a legitimacy perspective, having more than a majority confers kind of a sense of, it's rightful that they're making decisions. The problem is that we've got these different characteristics of things that we would like when we're translating votes into seats or into representation. We've got these goods that we would like from our electoral system, but no electoral system meets every one of these criteria in the best way, which leads to then a debate over what is the ideal electoral system that you could put in place in your country, in your local jurisdiction, in your province. And so as a result, there's three major types of electoral systems used to elect members to legislative bodies. The first is a plurality or majoritarian system, and so it includes things like a single member plurality, which is what we use in Canada, runoff elections, and preferential voting. Then there's proportional representation or PR systems, and then mixed member proportional. And so each of these, in terms of those characteristics we looked at on the last slide, things that we would like to have, each of these have different strengths and different weaknesses in terms of them. So one may, for example, allow for a greater link between representative and voters, but be weaker in terms of accurately kind of translating proportion of votes into number of seats. So at the end of the day, then when you're making the choices, you know that none of the systems ticking all of the boxes. So based on your local circumstances, you've got to choose the one that presents, the best advantages based on which one you prioritize of those different goods. So what are plurality or majoritarian electoral systems? So plurality or majoritarian systems typically involve electing a single representative based on which candidate has the most votes. A country or a province would be divided into different districts. And in each different district, there are different candidates running for to represent that district. And the candidate who receives the most votes wins that district and will represent that district in Parliament. In the majoritarian version, the electoral system is designed to try to ensure that the winning candidate has the support of a majority of those voting. In a plurality system, all they need is to have the most. So in the majoritarian version of the system, you'd have to get 50% plus one of the vote, percent of the vote. In a plurality electoral system, there's no threshold that you have to meet other than you have to get the most votes. So if there's 2 candidates running, then yes, you'd have to get a majority. If there's 3 candidates running, you'd have to get 33.33% plus 1. If there are 5 candidates running, you'd have to get 20% plus 1. So you've got to be the majority candidate. Plurality and majoritarian systems often result in a party gaining a majority of seats, even if that party did not win a majority of votes. So this is often the case where, for example, and we've talked about it in the past, take, say, a country that has 5 districts, right? And there's 3 parties running in each of the 5 districts. The same party gets a plurality of votes in all 5 districts, but in each of the districts, they only got 33.4% of the vote. So they got only just over a third of the vote, but they got 100% of the seats. And so oftentimes you're going to end up seeing in these type of systems a kind of skewed representation. So the percentage of vote a party gets doesn't translate into the number of seats. Some will get far fewer seats than you would expect based on the proportion of the vote they got, and some will get far more seats than you would expect based on the proportion of the vote. These systems tend to then be very strong in terms of representation because it's the country is divided into smaller districts and you're representing a representative for that district. Everybody kind of knows who their representative or can know who their representative is. That person goes to Parliament because of that district and is there to represent that district. So everyone knows if they have a complaint, who they can go to, who is their link to the government. So that's a strong feature of, say, this type of electoral system. A weakness is, like I said, in terms of the translating percentage of votes into percentage of representation. So it depends. If you were choosing this system, you'd have to, compared to another one, you'd have to look at how important is the representation. Oftentimes, many larger states may like this type of system. Say a geographically diverse state may like this type of system because of, say, regional differences and everyone wanting to have kind of local representation, it can be an advantage. Types of plurality majoritarian systems, so include single member plurality system. So voters in each electoral district elect a single representative to the legislature. Winner is whoever receives the most votes, but not necessarily the majority of votes. So advantages is it's a simple system. It's easy to understand. So you run it, there's different candidates running in your district. Whoever gets the most votes represents your district. Disadvantages, so like I said, distortion between votes and representation in legislature generally favors popular parties. So one of the effects definitely can be that in this type of system, smaller parties, so say third parties, don't get vote because people will vote strategically for one of the larger parties, knowing that those smaller parties don't have a chance of winning the district and they don't want to throw away their vote. It's a problem that NDP or the NDP had for years, the Green Party still has, is that people who may identify with those parties know, it, for example, in their district that that party has, say, no chance of winning. So rather than spoiling their vote or voting on principle, but not getting represented, they'll choose which of the, say, liberal or conservatives they prefer, knowing that the liberal conservatives have a legitimate shot of winning the district. So you do see that type of strategic voting going on, which can particularly disadvantage smaller parties. Runoff election, so an election held if no candidate receives a majority vote. So this is how many majoritarian systems will work. So you can have a majoritarian system easily if there's only two candidates. So if there's restrictions saying only two candidates, then a plurality system is essentially a majoritarian system. What majoritarian systems will do often if there's more than two candidates is they'll have two-stage voting. First, all candidates run. Those who receive the highest percentage of the vote, the two who receive the highest percentage of the vote will go into a runoff election. So usually it'll be in the first election, if somebody receives a majority, they win. If nobody receives a majority, those with the two highest move on to a runoff election where it's just the two of them. And because there's only two candidates, by necessity, one of them must receive more than 50% majority of the vote. So this would be the way that runoff elections take place. That's what we saw recently in the Georgia elections, where nobody received the elections that took place in early January. Because in November, nobody received for the Senate a majority of the vote, the two candidates who received the most proceeded into a January runoff election, where by necessity, one of them would receive more than 50%. And then finally, we've got preferential ballot. So the only difference here is that candidates are ranked in order of preference, and then there's some way of kind of weighting based on where the preference ordering is, how many points someone gets, and how candidates drop off. So rather than just saying, this is the person I'm voting for, if there's 5 candidates, you would rank them 1 through 5, and then there'd be some scoring system based on that for selecting the winning candidate. Before we turn to the other electoral systems, here's a selection of countries. So this isn't all the countries who have elections by any extent, but it is a pretty geographically diverse set for kind of an idea for the countries that use single member plurality, runoff, preferential ballot, PR, mixed member proportional, and single transferable vote. So single transferable vote being the most rare, followed by preferential ballot, both be quite rare. And then single member plurality, PR, proportional representation, mixed member proportional being all fairly common. Canada, the US, UK. So UK kind of having a large inspiration on the Canadian electoral system, and the US, our closest neighbor, are all SMP countries for electoral systems. Most of continental, or a good portion of continental Europe, if you look here, is either proportional representation or mixed member proportional. I'm not sure, just quickly looking at the list, I'm not sure any continental European country, none off the top of my head, and based on this is a single member plurality, and France is a runoff. But most of the rest are PR or mixed member PR. So what's a proportional representation system? So a PR system is where the proportion of seats that a party receives in the legislature reflects the proportion of votes it has obtained. So if a party receives 20% of the vote, it gets 20% of the seats. If a party gets 50% of the votes, it gets 50% of the seats. So the advantages here are in terms of accurately representing kind of party share of the vote in the legislature. That could be a large advantage. It also is favorable for smaller parties. A smaller party, for example, a Green Party that may get 10% of the vote in Canada, right? It may get 10% of the vote, but get 1 seat. Sometimes 0 seats, maybe 2 seats. Not much, so it's harder for the party to grow. In a PR system, if you got 10% of the seats, you get 10% of the legislature. And so you'd be able to develop a voice through that. An area of weakness is often in terms of representation. So because of the way that you kind of have to go off lists for a PR system. So often what will happen is that there's a list of candidates, and if you get 10% of the vote, and so say that translates into 50 candidates, the top 50 candidates on your list will get a seat. Because of that, there's less geographic representation, so it's harder for anyone to know who in the government do I contact, who's representing me, who's representing my local interests, because seats aren't necessarily allocated based on geographic diversity or geographic representation. PR systems almost always result in a situation where no single party has a majority, so often involves coalition governments. Because in a PR system, there's often many, many different parties. So it's very difficult in a situation with many parties for any party to gain a majority of votes. Even in a 3-party system, it's difficult for a particular party to get 50%. If you've got 7 or 8 parties, it could be almost impossible for a party to get a majority. So you end up with coalitions where more than one party agree to govern together. PR systems may reduce the strength of the link between the legislator and their district, which I talked about, and will tend to result in greater representation for women and minorities because individual candidates don't have to win their local district. All they have to do is get onto the party's list and be high enough on it. It's easier for women and minorities to gain representation. So say, for example, a political party really wants to have gender equity in its representation. Well, it can easily achieve that by having 50% of the names on its list be women. And even rank it, man, woman, man, woman, man, woman, to ensure that 50% of the representation is women. In a, say, single member plurality, you're fighting for each district, and if it turns out that women have a tougher time getting elected, or if there's fear that women will have, or minorities will have a tougher time getting elected, then they may not be nominated for seats or for being the candidate in districts, and they may lose more of the districts. So it could be harder to have gender equality. A mixed member proportional system is a mixture of single member plurality and a PR system. So it's kind of the idea is try to take some of the strengths from both and avoid some of the weaknesses from both. Where some legislators are elected to represent electoral districts, while others are elected based on popular vote received by their party, right? So there are still districts, they tend to be larger because it's not all seats that are allocated based on district, but it does mean that you still have a member of parliament who is representing your district, who is tied to you. But there's also some element of proportional voting where some of the district or some of the those elected is based purely on proportional representation system. So based on this system, you're never going to get as good of a representation as you're getting in a PR system. You're also not going to get as good of a link between voters and representatives as you're going to get in a single member plurality system. But you're also going to avoid many of the weaknesses. You're going to have better representation in terms of proportion of vote than you would in an SMP, and you're going to have better link between legislatures and and members of parliament than you would in a PR system. So it's not perfect on any of the characteristics, but it's better than both the systems. Variations include compository MMP used in Germany and parallel MMP systems used in Japan. You don't have to understand the differences between those. But the idea here more is to try to have, and there's both, like you see, there's a compository MMP and a parallel MMP system. There's multiple ways that they try to achieve this balance. All you really have to remember is that it's a mixture of kind of a single member plurality and a PR system with the goals of trying to avoid the weaknesses of both systems while maintaining as much of the strengths as possible. Once we understand electoral systems, we then turn to election campaigns, which is an important part of the electoral process. And there's three basic types of election campaigns: pre-modern, modern, and postmodern campaigns. Pre-modern campaigns were used in many countries until the 1960s, largely here due to changes between them have to do with technological changes. It involves considerable personal contact with voters, and campaigning was largely localized. Canvassing leaflets, leaders traveled country by train. So leaders tried to get around as much of the country as possible, speak to voters directly, locally, and then candidates would run very locally and try to meet with as many people, shake their hands, give them a leaflet, talk to them at local rallies. This was important at this time, largely because you didn't necessarily have technology for television where a leader could speak to the entire country at once. So if they wanted to speak to people and gain their vote, rather than being able to have a televised national address, they actually had to put in FaceTime in each of these different places and meet with the people. Yes, before in the 1960s, you would have had television addresses, and certainly you could have had newspapers, but it still wasn't the same as face-to-face contact that you could have either in person or through television. As technology changes, we change more into modern campaigns. Characteristics include reliance on opinion polling, professional consultants, television advertising, photo ops, and increasingly focused on the party leader and were very expensive. So campaigns became more scientific. They were much more national in terms of national apparatus, using a lot of photo opportunities for good moments that you could share on TV or in pictures. A lot less, say, traveling to local regions, because what you said in one region could be televised to another region. So you didn't have to be meeting as much face-to-face. A lot more scientific then in terms of where did you go. If you didn't have to go anywhere, you could use opinion polling to try to figure out where is it that you should go, where FaceTime would be beneficial in trying to win the district. So this also, along with that, goes in a lot more professional consultants. All of these things cost a whole lot of money, so much more expensive. And then finally, postmodern campaigns. Characteristics include use of communication technology, so newer communication technology, focus groups, controlled messaging, and permanent campaigns. So new communication technology, so we might be thinking social media here, certainly the internet, even if not social media. So Facebook posting, Twitter feeds. One of the kind of the elements of that, particularly in the US, that you may have noticed, is that it seems to be that campaigns are always kind of ongoing. It used to be campaigns would gear up right before an election, and then the apparatus would kind of gear down. You'd kind of govern for a while, and then it would ramp up before an election. To a large extent, that's more or less what you still see in Canada. There certainly is permanent apparatus to the political parties that are always thinking about fundraising and campaigning, but largely still have kind of the gear up for election and then go back down to normal. Where in the US, there definitely seems to be a lot more permanent campaigning. There's always looking for messaging for campaign purposes. There's always messaging for any different policy that you're going to advocate as government or any opposition critique you're going to put forward will be focus group to test how are people going to respond this type of messaging, how is this going to affect us electorally. And when we're looking at election campaigns, we want to make sure that people have informed choice. So election campaigns use diverse means to convey a party's basic message to the public, including advertising, party platforms, and leader speeches, right? And on the surface, these are all good, right? We want campaigns to be able to communicate with everyone so that everyone can understand what are the different leaders, platforms, what are the different party platforms, what are you choosing if you vote for someone? What do they stand for? So the more ways that they have to get those messages across, whether it's television or media ads that can communicate the clear party platforms, leaders who are able to give speeches, all of these help get the message out to voters. Unfortunately, one of the difficulties voters face is that they cannot be certain that promises made will be promises that are kept. And this is almost kind of a running joke that's not particularly funny, but a kind of a comical element of many democracies or many political campaigns is that you know, what's said at a campaign and what's actually done while governing are two very, very different things. Parties and candidates will promise things that they cannot possibly achieve or won't even try to achieve when they're governing. And some parties and some leaders and some candidates will get particularly bad reputations for this, which can be costly for them in elections. If their platform is not trusted that they'll be attempting to implement this while in office, if you can't trust the message that they're putting out, then this can be costly for them. Televised political advertising rarely includes detailed information. So this can be a problem of the format of television advertising. So 30-second spot advertising, it's hard to convey a whole lot of information. So rather than conveying a whole lot of information, there's often a lot of reliance on slogans, catchy catchphrases, on emotional appeals that will resonate with people without necessarily informing them. You also see a lot of negative and misleading advertising in campaigning, so misleading advertising, so presenting skewed facts. So if you're running, for example, on your economic record, presenting not necessarily lies, but misleading portrayal of your economic outcomes or the economic outcomes under your government, and negative ads. So this is when you're attacking the other side. So rather than saying what you're going to do, the ad is spent attacking the characteristics of another party or often of another candidate. So rather by trying to gain voters by saying we're good, trying to gain voters by saying the other one is bad. Now, despite all of these obstacles, if you follow campaigns carefully, you're often able to get still a strong sense of what the position of different candidates and different parties are. The problem still can be is that most people aren't particularly attentive, even during election season. So if the threshold for being able to be fully informed, having fully informed choice, given some of the limitations here on messaging and on providing information to voters, if that requires high levels of political attention, then most people are not going into voting and making an informed choice, a fully informed choice. So let's look now at voting behavior. So what are the long-term factors or the factors that can predispose people towards voting for particular parties, and ones that aren't that will say be able to predict alignment with a particular party or particular candidate across multiple elections as opposed to just short-term one proposal election. Now, many of these characteristics that we're about to look at are declining in importance in many advanced democracies, but they still remain important predictors often of votes. So one being class, one's position in the economy or a combination of income, education, and social status. We'll often refer to that as SES or social economic status, are often important predictors of votes. So if we look at political parties, many of them are even organized along kind of class type lines. So left-wing parties will more appeal to labor, and right-wing parties, conservative parties, will more appeal to business interests. So if you're part of kind of the lower or middle classes, you're more likely to go with left-wing. According to this logic, you're more predisposed towards more left-wing parties, more liberal parties. And if you're in the upper classes, you're more predisposed towards conservative parties because they're seeking to represent your interests. Religion, there's often a relationship between religion and voting choice in some countries. This is generally quite weak in Canada. There's some element of, say, the Christian right voting, say, with the Conservative Party. But other than that, there's not a strong relationship between religion and voting in Canada. In other countries, that's not necessarily the case. So in the US, for example, the evangelical Christians and Roman Catholics, for example, can often be more found alignment with the with our Republicans. Many Black churches in the U.S. would be more associated with the Democrats, for example. Ethnic, racial, and cultural groups, most frequently apparent in countries with minority groups with distinctive identities. So certainly, if you remember when we talked about the US election, we did look at kind of ethnic breakdown or racial breakdown on voting, and we did see important divisions. So for example, African-American voters were far more likely to vote Democratic. There was more of a split when it came to Latino voters. So it will depend on the different minority groups and how kind of shared their identities are, or how linked their fate is viewed. So if you view kind of the success of one member of your group as impacting the success of yourself, so there's kind of a shared fate among members of the minority group, then you're more likely to vote as a cohesive group. If you view kind of the successfulness of another member of your ethnic group doesn't impact your likelihood of your success, then you're not as likely to vote along ethnic, cultural, or racial lines. Region. So there's certainly, particularly in larger countries, you'll see regional variations in voting. These include differences in political culture that can be caused by difference in political culture or local economy. Also differences in evaluation on how governments will reflect regional interests. So for example, in Canada, there's differences between often Western provinces and central provinces and Atlantic provinces. For example, in terms of representation, there's often been a critique of some political parties that they represent the central provinces of Quebec and Ontario because of their electoral importance. And so there's difference in, there's a desire to support different political parties that will take Western views more into account. There's also differences in the Canadian economy based on region. And so this can lead to support for different political parties. Gender, generally, most countries, there's not a strong gender difference in voting for different political parties. But there still is often a noticeable difference in voting. Often women will vote slightly more for center left and left parties compared to men. Men will tend to be slightly more conservative in their voting than women. That's not universally the case. There certainly are conservative women and very liberal men, but on average, women will tend to vote slightly more liberally, and men will tend to vote slightly more conservatively. There's some evidence in some countries that gender differences are actually increasing. age is definitely an important kind of longer term or predictor of vote. Generally speaking, in most countries, younger voters tend to go more for the more liberal parties. So Green parties, for example, so in Canada, maybe for the Green or NDP. Younger voters are much more likely to vote for those parties. And then older voters are more likely than other age groups to vote for conservative parties. So kind of there's the logic that the older you get, the more conservative you often get. Now, there's certainly younger voters who will vote for conservative parties, and there's older voters who will vote for the Green or NDP party. But in terms of patterns, we would see an age difference often in voting. We'll see a rural versus urban divide. Oftentimes, urban voters will be more liberal and rural voters will be more conservative. If you remember when we looked at kind of the election map for the US, kind of breaking down vote by region, we saw the cities, even in the South, were typically quite liberal, or in Republican states were typically quite liberal in their voting, quite democratic in their voting, and rural areas, even in typically democratic northern states, were actually quite conservative. So there's definitely a strong rural divide, certainly an ideological divide in how people vote. So those who are more liberal will typically vote for more liberal political parties, and conservative will typically vote for more conservative political parties. That makes a lot of sense. And then finally, party identification. So many people have developed lasting attachments to particular parties, and so they'll vote based on that attachment. So they self-identify as a member of the Liberal Party of Canada, the New Democratic Party of Canada, the Conservative Party of Canada, the Green Party of Canada, and so they're likely to vote along with that party. Even if another party may represent their interests quite well, they're likely to vote along with that party. So party identification is a very strong predictor often of voting. There are certain elections where it won't work, certain anomalous elections. So for example, there were, when Ronald Reagan was president, there was a group referred to as Reagan Democrats. So they're people whose party identification was Democrat, but they preferred Ronald Reagan. So they still maintain their attachment, their long-term attachment was Democratic. But during those elections, they went with Reagan. It's not a perfect, so party identification, while it should seem like it should almost be a perfect predictor, it's not a perfect predictor, but it's a very strong predictor of vote. We then also have short-term influences on voting. So many people, yes, there are certain people who will know right as soon as an election campaign starts who they're voting for. But many people will end up deciding during the election campaign, oftentimes in highly contentious elections, even will make their decision on who they're going to vote for in the days or hours or minutes leading up to their actual vote. So some of the factors that influence voting kind of more short term, so won't affect kind of long term voting patterns, but can sway kind of individual elections or voting in individual elections. So we'll include things like leaders. So as people become less and less tied to particular parties, and as the media attention focuses more and more on leaders and less on, say, local candidates. So many people who are, for example, voting in Canadian elections won't know even which candidate that they're voting for. So when you vote in Canada, you're not voting for prime minister, right? You're voting for the local candidate for your political party, and then prime minister is chosen by who gets the most seats. So you're not directly actually voting for, say, Justin Trudeau, unless you happen to live in his electoral district. Then you would be voting for him, but not as prime minister, just as member of parliament. But increasingly, many people still could not name who, say, the Liberal or Conservative or New Democrat or Bloc Québécois candidate is in their electoral district. They just know who the party leader is, and they're making the decision based on that party leader. And so as leaders take more and more of a central stage, and as partisanship, so as people's attachment, party identification decreases. So saying that I'm always a liberal, I'm always a conservative, I'm always a New Democrat. As people I kind of identify as independent and they make their party choices each election, the role of the leader can become very important. Candidates themselves, so I just finished saying that candidates have become less important, but candidates still can sway voting. Generally less important than party leaders, but in particularly some circumstances can influence decision making. This is particularly the case if it's a candidate who's been, for example, in power for a long time, so it's well known and well respected in their district, or in terms of candidates who are, say, former or current cabinet ministers, so they have high name recognition because of their role in government and because of, say, being in cabinet, so they've you know, been in the media, been in press events, have taken a fairly central role within the government, or star candidates. You know, you recruit a prominent athlete, a prominent member of the, business community, so someone who's well known, just a prominent name who before politics has a high name recognition from non-political activities. When they come into politics, they already bring in that name recognition. And so that can have an effect on voting. Someone might say, hey, I recognize that person. They played for my favorite hockey team. That's exciting. I want to vote for that person. So candidates in those type of contexts can have a larger role. Finally, issues. Many voters cite issues as the most important reason for their vote choice. And so they'll look at, if this election, the issue that's most important to me is COVID-19, I'm going to look at what are the different party platforms on COVID-19 and make my choice based on that. In the next election, it might be the economy, it may be healthcare. And so I'll reevaluate my party choice based on healthcare policies in the next election or based on economic policies in the next election, but this one's on COVID-19, or this one's on the decision that we made to go to war recently, and I didn't like that, so I'm voting on that particular issue. Valence issues are those on which the contending parties differ as to which party is most competent to deal with the problem rather than taking different positions. And then finally, short-term influence also can be based on looking back at what happened with the last government. So we'll refer to, this is often referred to as retrospective voting, so looking back. So elements will include accountability. So many studies indicate that voters evaluate a government's performance and hold them accountable through elections. So if they did poorly, they're punished. So they look back at how they performed, they did poorly, and so they're punished. Or if they did well, they had a lot of successes, they're rewarded. So we use kind of their past performance to evaluate whether we should support them. Strategic voting, voters upset with the policies of the government vote for the candidate with the best chance of defeating the representative of the current government rather than on their preferred one. So for example, if there's a political party that's particularly unpopular at a given point, either they've been in government just too long and they've just managed over that time to kind of piss off too many people, or the leader is just obnoxious and has irritated just so many people rather quickly, you may make your vote choice less on who's my favorite candidate, but best on who can get rid of this person. So you're less voting for that candidate and more you're voting for that you want to get rid of a particular candidate, and this is the best route to do so. This is something that can often advantage in Canadian context the Conservatives and Liberals as the two biggest political parties. So for example, imagine the Conservatives are in government and you hate the Conservatives and your choice is between the Liberals and the New Democrats. And so you're looking at it and say, which of these better represents my views? So that's what we would normally expect someone to do. And so maybe they would choose the New Democrats, maybe they choose the Liberals. According to strategic voting, the calculation would be less which of the Liberals or New Democrats best represents my views, and it'd be which of these has the best chance of getting the Conservatives out of government. And I'm going to choose that one. Because the Liberals are bigger, they're often going to be advantaged in terms of those type of strategic voting calculations. Many people will say, if you ask them about the issues, hey, I love the New Democrats, wish I could vote for the New Democrats, I want to vote for the New Democrats. But at the end of the day, when they show up, they vote strategically instead, and they go with the Liberals. So something that we could see in like the 2015 election. And then finally, economic conditions. Incumbent parties generally tend to do well when the economy is performing well and tend to do poorly when the economy is faltering. In many countries, one of the strongest, if not the strongest predictor of electoral results will be the state of the economy. If the economy is doing well, it's very difficult to unseat the party that's in power. If the economy is doing poorly, it's much easier to unseat the party that's in power. So economic conditions are major predictors of election outcomes. Many people contend, just looking back at the last presidential election, that had it not been for COVID-19, the poor response of, say, the Trump government, but also the negative effects on the economy, if it hadn't been for that, and if the U.S. economy had continued to go strong, many actual really strong, well-performing models for predicting election outcomes actually expected that Trump would win. Had it not been for COVID, that changed all the different calculations. But despite his tremendously low approval ratings, and despite many people, including many Republicans, finding his behavior distasteful, at the end of the day, most people vote their pocketbook. And if their economy is doing well, if they've got a good job, they're not going to rock the boat. They're not going to change their voting. So people, are able to swallow a lot of things they don't like in terms of personal behavior of a leader if the economy is doing well for them, because they don't want to risk a change that could risk harming their economic situation. All right, that's all for today. I hope you enjoyed the election on elections and voting, and we'll see you next time.